that the India-Pakistan relations were at one of their lowest points in a number of decades, and they were closer to going to war than at any time since the Kargil crisis. And in that sense, the ceasefire has really de-escalated things. That it will be a fragile ceasefire because we know that tensions remain quite high between both countries. We had seen a consistent position from the U.S. government calling for de-escalation. So there definitely had not been any type of active mediation early on. The U.S. position from the start had been calling for de-escalation, even though indeed Vice President Vance and President Trump had signaled that the U.S. was only going to do so much. Well, it's been quite a week. It's really been quite a few weeks, given how we saw such a major escalation in tensions so quickly over the last few days, and then further to be this very sudden ceasefire that appeared to come out of nowhere. It really is quite remarkable. I think that the India-Pakistan relations were at one of their lowest points in a number of decades, and they were closer to going to war than at any time since the Kargil crisis. And in that sense, the ceasefire has really de-escalated things in a big way. But I think that it will be a fragile ceasefire because we know that tensions remain quite high between both countries.
But what do you think prompted U.S. to take, because earlier J.D. Vance in an interview said that we don't want to intervene into, it is a matter of two countries. What made U.S. to intervene in the matter and talk to the both sides and initiate these ceasefire talks?
So, I mean, I should say that from the start, we had seen a consistent position from the U.S. government calling for de-escalation. So there definitely had not been any type of active mediation early on in the crisis, but the U.S. position from the start had been calling for de-escalation, even though indeed Vice President Vance and President Trump had signaled that the U.S. was only going to do so much. However, I would argue that there are two reasons why we saw the U.S. jump in the way it did to push for a ceasefire. The first reason is escalation dynamics. You know, this was a crisis that escalated very quickly. You had significant levels of military action that were used by both sides. The initial Indian airstrikes in Pakistan in retaliation for the terrorist attack in Kashmir were of a greater scale than we've seen in Pakistan for many years. And then Pakistan's response, and then the fact that both countries were sending drones and missiles into each other's countries and targeting military sites. This I think was quite alarming for the U.S. government, just because this was a level of hostilities that had not been seen for many years. The second reason why I think the U.S. intervened, and I think this is really the major reason, is the nuclear issue. My sense is that the U.S. government was very concerned when you had the Indians targeting a particular air base in Rawalpindi, which is known to be near nuclear sites, and also the fact that Pakistan's own signaling in terms of convening certain types of meetings, or plans to convene certain types of meetings, suggested the possibility that they were prepared to talk about the risk of nuclear contingencies. So I think that this is actually a consistent pattern in U.S. policy when it comes to India-Pakistan crises. If you look at the history, the U.S. has frequently intervened in India-Pakistan military crises, mainly because of concerns about nuclear risks. And that I think was the case in Kargil. It was the case in 2001, 2002. And according to Mike Pompeo in his memoir, it was also the case in 2019. Pompeo, of course, was the Secretary of State during that crisis. So I think at the end of the day, it was a sudden concern on the part of the U.S. that the nuclear escalation risks in this crisis were real.
So we have seen another post from U.S. President where he talks about mediating between India and Pakistan when it comes to the Kashmir issue. Keeping in mind that the recent tensions were not related to the Kashmir issue, but they were related to terror incident. So when U.S. President talks about mediating regarding the Kashmir issue, which was not the issue for which the tensions were recently escalated. So how do you see the statement on Kashmir, and what will be the long-term implication of this statement?
Well, it's definitely very significant in that, in my view, it goes further than previous statements that Trump has made about Kashmir. When he was president the first time, I believe on two occasions he had indicated that he would be happy to mediate on the Kashmir issue if both sides agreed. But he had that condition, and of course, India would have no interest in this type of contingency. But this time, he appeared to suggest that this was an open-ended offer, that he's ready to talk about this issue. So that's very significant. I think that it is notable for the reason that you mentioned that he makes this comment now, because indeed the recent crisis was not really about Kashmir. I mean, of course, the terrorist attack that precipitated the crisis happened in Kashmir, but on the whole, this was about other things. So one wonders why he was prompted to make this comment when he did. Now, of course, this being President Trump, he's very unpredictable, and sometimes he'll say something and then not necessarily mean it. He may have just thought at any one point, well, this is something that I understand has been a big problem for the two countries, and maybe I should, be the peace broker that I think I could be. I don't know. So in that sense, I think we shouldn't read too much into it. First of all, it's not going to go anywhere, of course, because this is not something that India would want to discuss. But I think that from a symbolic perspective, it's significant in that, this is a pretty strong statement from a U.S. president about Kashmir. It's been a long time since we've heard something like this. And the final point I'll make is that for Pakistan, Pakistan will see this as a major diplomatic victory, which it is, in a sense, in that for them, for the Pakistanis, what is one of their core foreign policy goals? Is to see the Kashmir issue internationalized. Well, they've definitely done that somehow, given that the president of the United States has called to seek a solution to it. So I think that Pakistan does seem to get some type of boost, diplomatic boost from this. But again, though, I don't think we should read too much into this comment in terms of what it could actually lead to, which I think is not much at all.
So we saw the reports in New York Times and several other publications where they talk about the attack on the particular base which was near to nuclear facilities. So, how real was the nuclear threat at this point of time during this escalation? And because we have seen in past Pakistan ministers claiming that we have these weapons and we are not keeping it just for show. How real it was this time? And was it the main reason that this mediation and this ceasefire was agreed to?
And I think that the reason why the nuclear issue was a big factor in this crisis was because the level of conventional military hostilities was increasing to levels that we've not seen for so long. And because of that, because the two sides were climbing up so high on the escalation ladder, invariably because these two countries had nuclear weapons, there would be growing concerns about the risk of escalation to nuclear levels. I had no reason to think that there was any contemplation of any type of decision related to nuclear weapons. And I should say this as well. It's not unusual to hear this type of saber rattling from the Pakistani side, sort of boasting about Pakistan's nuclear capacities, signaling this idea that there is a risk of nuclear conflict. I think that's partly done for a global audience, to try to get the attention of the world, to try to inspire it to pay more attention to the crisis and to try to pressure India to rein things in, so to speak. I certainly think that was the case with this crisis, and I think that's been the case in the past. And if that's true, it worked, because indeed, I think it's quite clear that the two main U.S. officials leading the U.S. response in this crisis, Vance and Rubio, they were both, I think, provoked by the need to be more involved once they started to fear possible nuclear escalation risk.
Michael, I just want to understand from you how different this crisis was from the previous crisis. What was different in this crisis, if we talk about? Was it the way Indians strike Pakistan, terror camps in Pakistan, or the military bases? How different it was, and why was it so different?
Different compared to 2019? Is that what you mean?
2019 or other crises we have seen,
Okay.
like deep into, because the strikes were made deep into Pakistan this time.
Right. I mean, I think that this crisis was so different on so many levels. I mean, I would acknowledge that there were some basic similarities compared to what we saw in 2016 and 2019, in the sense that there was an attack in Kashmir that India concluded Pakistan was behind. It provoked an Indian military response. So yes, I mean that's what happened in this case. That's what happened in the last few cases. However, very different for so many reasons. First, the nature of the attack that triggered this crisis was, in my view, so different and so unusual. It was unusually brutal. Of course, the Pulwama attack was deadlier than the attack this time. But in this case, of course, the fact that civilians, that tourists were targeted, and they were singled out for their religion, for being Hindus, this, I think, had a particular type of traumatic impact on India in ways that we have not seen with previous ones, which I think necessitated, in the view of the Indian government and certainly much of the Indian public too, necessitated a particularly robust retaliation. And that's what we saw. I mean, as I believe I said earlier, the scale and intensity of the initial Indian airstrikes in Pakistan were of a magnitude that we have not seen for many decades since the 1971 war. So that's a big difference right there. Another difference is how Pakistan responded. Pakistan responded, I mean, with the fog of war element, it's sort of hard to know exactly what happened on the whole, but we do know that Pakistan responded initially with heavy shelling, and then things escalated to a point where you had additional levels of hostilities with drones and missile strikes going into both countries, hitting military targets. 2016, 2019, we didn't have anything like that, right? 2016, there was an Indian response, and things pretty much wrapped up. 2019, there was an Indian strikes in Balakot, and then you had Pakistan scramble jets. There was a dogfight. Pilot was shot down. He was released. Things ended. But what was so different about this case is that it was not just another example of a strike, a counter-strike, and then a push for de-escalation. The hostilities lasted longer. So I think for many reasons, this was very different than anything we've seen in terms of a military crisis between the two, going back for a number of decades. And one reason why, the fact that there was so much exchange of hostilities over a fairly long period of time, a few days. This is another reason why so many capitals around the world, Washington and London and the EU and various capitals in the Middle East, were so concerned about the direction of this crisis.
So, have you noticed any sort of difference in leadership between Pakistan and India? The response, the type of response there was a different type of response from the both sides. Do you notice any particular differences between the two sides of leadership, and particularly about the Indian leadership? Have you noticed any particular point that you have noticed during this recent conflict that this was done differently this time?
A response, you mean military or just diplomatic or
diplomatic,
on the whole?
All the response, military, diplomatic, the way the strikes were done, the way the situation was handled, the way US was, all the countries were involved and they were apprised about the strikes and they were involved into this conflict. What do you have to say? Have you noticed any kind of, what do you have to say about the leadership that we have in both the countries?
Well, I mean, I think that the Indian leadership was, I think, similar. Of course, it's been, if you look at the last few crises between India and Pakistan, 2016, 2019, and now this recent one, it's of course the same government in India. It's been the Modi government, and I think that the leadership has responded in similar ways. Hitting back, projecting strength, confidence, defiance, and so on. That hasn't really changed. On the Pakistani side, I would argue that, we've seen similarities as well with what we've seen in the past, in defiance. Though clearly in this case, Pakistan the leadership was willing to deploy more force than it had in 2019 and certainly 2016. What I think is very interesting is to contrast the leadership responses of the two countries at the end of this crisis, if we can assume it's over, and I think it is for now. After the ceasefire was announced, when we heard public comments from Indian officials, they were decidedly more measured, I would argue, than what we heard from the Pakistani side, where there was a triumphant, even a victorious tone to their comments, which I think makes sense because, let's be very clear, Pakistan's leadership is much less popular than India's leadership is at home, right? And I think that for Pakistan's leadership, both civilian and military, it was important to really convey this idea that Pakistan had won in some ways, to deliver this message that Pakistan had taught a lesson to India, had dealt blows to India's military and so on in order to, win back some goodwill, rally the public around the leadership. This being a public in Pakistan that's shown significant levels of anti-army sentiment in recent months. So I think that it was important politically for the Pakistani leadership to project this as something successful and big and so on. Whereas in India, it's different. I think that I can understand from India's perspective, this whole crisis was provoked by state-sponsored terrorism. That's the Indian position, and in that sense, this is it's a very serious, solemn matter, so to speak. And in that sense, I think it's notable that we have recently seen more details coming from the Indian government about the results of the initial airstrikes on Pakistan targeting terrorist sites. And I think that's important, too, to convey to the Indian public that, look, this is what we achieved. This is what we set out to do, to degrade terrorist infrastructure in Pakistan. These were the results. And I think that's an important message to deliver to the Indian public. And it's not about winning or losing. It's about achieving the tactical and perhaps more broadly the strategic goals that India has to protect itself from this threat.
So my last question would be about how fragile is this ceasefire? Can we expect Pakistani side to... we saw yesterday night there was a violation of ceasefire. Indian side has said there is a violation of ceasefire. How fragile is this? Can we expect Pakistani to adhere to it and accept it for a long time?
I mean, it's been some time now. I mean, I'm speaking to you about 24 hours after we learned of the ceasefire. So that's significant indeed. There have been a few violations, but it's held. And I think that's significant given how tense relations were when the ceasefire was negotiated. It is fragile. One reason is the fact that it came about so quickly. Which suggests that it may not have had the types of assurances and guarantees that you would want to get for an accord like that. And also, as I said before, it was put together very hastily at a moment when both bilateral tensions and military hostilities between the two had reached their highest point in the entire crisis. So to go from a point of high tensions, significant levels of exchanges of force to the ceasefire, that to me suggests a bit of a risk that things could unravel at some point. My sense, and we're still trying to figure out exactly how things played out, my sense is that India might have a bit of a different interpretation of this than the U.S. Side does. India did not initially use the term ceasefire in its public statements about this, whereas the U.S. did, of course, and certainly the Pakistanis did. To me, it seems like it could be, it is fragile and will continue to be fragile. But that then raises the question of, will there be discussions between the Indians and the Pakistanis to talk more to ensure that they can reduce the possibility that ceasefire will be broken? Will the U.S. continue to be involved in conversations with the two? I mean, I think the answer to these questions will help us better understand how durable this ceasefire could be.
Michael, I'm left with one question. I forgot to ask you about the role of China and Turkey that two countries played in this conflict. We saw their statements; they were clearly on the side of Pakistan, and we saw Turkish drone inside. India has identified Turkish drone and Chinese equipment. Also, what is the role China and Turkey played in this crisis?
I think that one of the things that stands out about this crisis is how other countries' arms were used in the conflict. And indeed, I mean, Pakistan, of course, has long looked to China as a key military supplier. But the fact that Turkish arms were involved here as well, I mean, it signals that Pakistan has been able to diversify its sources of critical arms supplies, which I think is significant. And this suggests to me that uh, it's going to become even more complicated when when you think about how India-Pakistan relations will play out. India, of course, has long diversified its sources of arms suppliers. There's, of course, the Russia connection. There's also the U.S. in more recent decades, as well as France and Israel. But you now have Pakistan in a position where it is able to be using, not just acquiring, but using in the battlefield weapons from its tried and true ally China, as well as Turkey. And my understanding is that the U.S. has imposed some pretty significant constraints on what purposes Pakistan can use the F-16 jets that it gets from the U.S. and it could use them only for counterterrorism purposes, not to be used against India. So that might, I think, give Pakistan an even greater incentive to try to build out its defense supplies and diversify its sources of suppliers in ways that it could try to, maintain parity with India to the extent that it can, even though that's difficult to do, when there are those limits on U.S. arms. And also the U.S.-Pakistan security partnership is nothing like what it had been in previous decades. So, yeah, I think it just goes to show the international the role of other countries, the roles they play in terms of the military assistance, the arms that they provide to both India and Pakistan, and how that can play out in these crises, and indeed how it could lead to, I think, more intense uses of conventional, even if limited, military force.